I think resentment at minority groups is often a big pitch for these strongman leaders. It's really striking that obviously Trump, when he came in, was sort of build the wall and even attempted to ban all Muslims from entering the United States. But
that was the first thing he tried to do.
Indeed. But if you look at Modi in India, it's a very majoritarian, it's Hindu nationalism, really, more even than Indian nationalism, and aimed to a considerable extent at the Muslim minority. There in China, they've interned 1 million Uyghurs, and again, it's a sort of majoritarian thing. And in Europe, I think a lot of the kind of far-right figures are campaigning on the idea that the nation is at risk because of social change and migration. And yet I think migration in mixed societies are kind of the way of the world, and we all have to get used to it and learn to look at the benefits of it. But there's a very sort of strong generation of strongman leaders who are finding it's a very fertile theme for them. And so, you could say inequality is another driver, but it's easier to think of, well, there are economic policies, adjustments you can make, it's hard, but you can imagine the policy adjustments that would deal with that set of resentments.
But if you can demonize those people.
Exactly.
Right.
Demonizing those people is kind of key for a lot of these strongman leaders, and those people aren't going anywhere unless you do something really kind of horrific, like a mass internment.
Now, it's interesting that in the case of Ukraine, we are seeing these mass numbers of migrants coming into Europe and coming into countries that have some strong man leaders.
Yeah.
And that hasn't driven them, even though they're clearly outsiders, but they're European outsiders.
Yeah.
Is that enough?
Well, I think the European outsiders thing does matter. I mean, I think that people, it's pointless to deny that people are more likely to feel compassion for people who maybe look a bit like them, whose lives look a bit similar and so on. Even in London, we would watch the videos from Ukraine and say, boy, their flats don't look so different from our flats. They're walking the dog like we are. It doesn't look like Yemen or Tigray, which seems that much further away. And I think there is something human. I mean, why do they say the Arab world is particularly upset by the Palestinian issue more than the rest of the world? Because they feel a closeness to them. So I don't think it's that surprising that if you're Poland, even if you've been very resentful or fearful of migrations of Muslims, which really isn't happening even in Poland, but the Ukrainians are next door neighbors. Plus, I think they feel what's happening to them could happen to us. There's a common sense of threat about Russia.
One of the stats that always struck me, and I'm sure you've seen it, is when you ask Europeans how many Muslims actually are in your population. And the guesses are between 5 and sometimes 20x what the numbers actually are, because that demonization works so effectively in the politics.
Absolutely, and I think in France, for example, actually they don't even know because the census doesn't count them because it's part of a sort of ideological thing. But yeah, absolutely, I think that people feed off anecdote, and maybe in big cities the populations of immigrants of all sorts, Muslims and others, are quite visible and so on. But it was interesting, say in the UK during the Brexit referendum, that the areas of the country that felt most strongly about immigration were probably the areas that had least of it. It was something that was going on in people's heads rather than, London, which is a massively migrant city. I think now almost 40% of the population of London was born overseas. And if you count people like me whose parents were born overseas, you're getting up to 80%. It's extraordinary. But it voted very strongly to remain in the EU, which was the sort of pro-migration vote. Whereas areas that had less migration were much more suspicious of it.